I know this case has been going on for quite a while. The defense case is starting today, and we are going to try to move things along and try to get you out of here. We do appreciate your service. On my first day of law school, I'll never forget the first thing the professor said. When you're in a trial, if you have the facts, if the facts are on your side, pound the facts. If you have the law's on your side, pound the law. And if you have neither, pound the table. Now, our case, the defense case, Officer Collins' case, is just the facts. I'm here today to tell you what the facts are and why those facts will lead to a not guilty verdict. But Mr. Osserer, in closing arguments, will tell you about the law. All right? Now, the extent to which the state's case is just pounding the table, I'll let you decide. Or maybe it's pounding a square peg into a round hole. Not bringing in certain witnesses, picking and choosing, hiring the out-of-state police brutality team to come on in at top dollar to try to prove a serious crime. But the facts are there, and I tend to pound the facts. Now, one of the places we have to start in evaluating this case is with Mr. Ellis. Now, I was taught not to speak ill of the dead, and I have no intention to badmouth somebody who's no longer with us. We talked about in jury selection how horrible it is to have a loved one, a family member who's got a problem with drug addiction. But this is a murder case and a manslaughter case, and my client has been charged with both of those things. And we know that Mr. Ellis was high on methamphetamine on March 3rd. We know he had 2,400 nanograms per milliliter in his blood. And the degree to which that affected his behavior is highly relevant in understanding who he was on that night and what these officers were faced with on March 3rd of 2020. And oftentimes in a case like this, you don't really know. You don't know how drugs might affect somebody. In this case, we do. And so we're going to start with Mr. Ellis. We know that he started using drugs when he was around 20, so he had about 13 years of meth addiction. And we know that in 2015, he had a violent encounter with police. And the defense is going to raise that, again, not to disparage Mr. Ellis, but to see what police officers who dealt with Mr. Ellis when he was under the influence of methamphetamine had to deal with. And in 2015, he was accused of a crime, and the police responded. Now, in that case, interestingly, Mr. Ellis was compliant initially in his contact with the police. They put him in handcuffs, and he said, "Hey, I've got a bad shoulder. Would you mind putting me in 2 sets of handcuffs?" And because he'd been compliant up to that point, the officers agreed. They put him in 2 sets of handcuffs, gave him a little extra room. But that was a ruse, because once he was in the back of the police car, officers noticed that he started reaching into his pockets. He had 2 sets of handcuffs, he had extra room, and the officers noticed that he had a needle, a drug needle, an intravenous drug needle, filled with methamphetamine in his pocket. And they said, "Knock it off. Quit reaching for your pocket." He refused. He had to be taken out of the car, and then the fight was on. And eerily similar to the incident in 2020, Mr. Ellis had no quit in him. 3 officers had to hold him down to try to get the needle out of his pocket, try to get him in regular cuffs. They had to tase him twice. They had to hobble him. He was kicking and bucking and biting and banging his head on the gravel, getting scars on his cheeks, and 3 officers had to hold him down. They had to hobble him because he was kicking and bucking and wiggling, trying to move and get away. He had no quit in him, ladies and gentlemen. A few years later, in 2019, you heard about the incident at the A&W. I won't get into the specifics of what happened, except to say that he was eventually running naked down the street, and the police had to try to take him into custody. And you'll see the video of that incident. A passerby was able to capture that. And you'll see how Mr. Ellis responds to police when he's high on methamphetamine. At one point, the officers have him down, and he's being minimally compliant on the ground, but he's still looking up. He's making a lot of noises that you'll hear are very consistent with what we have in 2020. And then abruptly, he charges at the officers. He ran towards them. He didn't try to flee. He ran towards the officers, had no quit in him. They had to tase him. And he immediately jumped up again, and they had to tase him a second time. And then it was the same thing, the struggle, trying to get him in handcuffs, trying to get him restrained. They tried to call for aid. He was resistant to aid. Said, leave me the fuck alone. Nobody touch me. He didn't want anybody to even help him. So we know how drugs affect Mr. Ellis based on those two incidents. So as you'll see, Mr. Ellis was charged with a crime, robbery, attempted robbery, for that 2019 incident. And he went to court, he pled not guilty, and he was assigned what we call conditions of release by the judge. The judge said, Mr. Ellis, I'll let you out, but one of the things you have to do is go into treatment. Another thing you have to do is you cannot use drugs while you're out. You can't use drugs. So, for a period of time, he's doing well, right? He's getting sober, he's going to church, he's playing the drums, doing good things. He's also going to treatment. And in his treatment, he was having a counseling session with one of his treatment providers, and he was asked about the 2019 incident, about what happened, what got you to that state where you tried to rob the A&W, you took off your clothes, you tried to fight the police officers. What got you to that point? And Mr. Ellis said, I was in a state of meth-induced psychosis. Those are his own words during a treatment session. So he knew how methamphetamine could affect him. And he had all the reason in the world to stay clean. And he was, right? He was staying clean, he was playing the drums, he was going to church. You heard about March 3rd. He was doing well. You heard that he had a conversation with his mom. He talked about coronavirus. He said, Mom, what's going on with this coronavirus? This is crazy. So he was doing well. And then we don't know what happened, right? We know about Manuel Everson and how he and Manny Ellis both left that night and never returned. And we also heard that there was bad meth on the street during that time. So that's Officer Collins. You know him, you've seen him, you've been watching him in court. I'll tell you, Officer Collins, my client, Mr. Officer's client, is excited to talk to you. He's expressed to me a number of times how frustrating it is to be on trial and have to listen to your dumb lawyers talk the whole time instead of being able to get up and tell the jury what happened, why you did what you did. So he's excited to talk to you, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about him until he has a chance to take the stand. Officer Collins is married. His wife's been present. Her name's Lisa. She's been present a number of times throughout this trial. They've got 4 kids, a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. His parents have been here throughout the trial supporting him. His dad was military, his career military, and so Matt grew up as in the Army. I think you call them Army brats. He was going from base to base, and never spent more than a few years in any one location as a kid. One of his hobbies was wrestling. He was a wrestler in high school, called a grappler. He would eventually be a coach on his Army wrestling team when they weren't deployed. He had about 20 years of grappling and wrestling experience before this incident in 2020. He went to college after high school. He graduated with a degree in history. I hesitate slightly to tell you. In every case, you've got good facts and bad facts. Good fact is that he went to college here in the Northwest. Bad fact is he went to the University of Oregon. So I would ask you not hold that against him. I noticed the shirts you all wore. But he graduated with a degree in history from the University of Oregon. And then he decided to serve his country. And he enlisted in the United States Army. And he had an option of going to OCS and pursuing being an officer. Decided that he wanted to serve and earn the respect of the higher-ups before he became one. And so for 8 years as an Army Ranger, Officer Collins served his country. multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. He served our country. Eventually, the stress of the deployments, he got married to Lisa. They'd had their first child. She was pregnant with their second child. The stresses of the routine deployments started to wear on him and his family, causing stress in the family, and so he decided to retire from his military service, and he was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army as a Ranger after 8 years. Officer Collins wanted to keep serving his community, and so he went to the police academy in Tacoma, and he was elected president of his class by his colleagues. He was top of his class at the police academy. He's been a police officer up until this incident for 5 years, not a single blemish on his record. He, along with his partner, Officer Burbank, won the Medal of Merit as police officers for Tacoma PD. They responded to a situation where a clerk at a at a convenience store had been assaulted. And when they arrived and were taking the statement of the convenience store retail clerk, the assailant returned with a 15-inch butcher knife, screaming, "Kill me, kill me!" And Officers Burbank and Collins did not kill him, but they were able to safely de-escalate the situation and take that person into custody. And for that, they won the Medal of Merit, given to them by the mayor of Tacoma. Officer Collins has 8 commendations along with that Medal of Merit. Now, you've all seen this slide. This is a view of 96 and Ainsworth, South Tacoma, an aerial view. And we've all heard, we talked about it in jury selection, that this area of Tacoma is a rougher part of town. And there are drugs and gangs and murders and rapes and all of that. But it's also a residential area. And there are homes here. That's really all there are in that main area. And with homes come families, and there's kids. And there needs to be police. And Officer Collins and Burbank and Rankin are the guys that patrol this rough neighborhood to protect these people. They work the graveyard shift in probably the roughest part of town, one of the roughest parts of our state. And you're going to hear from our witnesses who are going to tell you how tough of a job it is. I know you already know that, but their job is to protect these folks. And that's the picture, a little bit zoomed in on 96 and Ainsworth. And I know you've seen that, but just looking at that picture, I'd like you to notice the nature of that intersection. It hasn't really come up too much, but there's a driveway there. And as you know, a lot of the action in this case takes place in the middle of the road. And you probably know how dangerous that is for police officers and for Mr. Ellis and others to be out in the middle of the road at night when people are driving, maybe people are drinking and driving, when they could be turning into the intersection, or maybe even turning into that driveway. So on March 3rd, 2020, and I won't go up and show too closely, I think we're all pretty aware of what was going on, but as you know, our incidents here, the officers are facing west on 96th. But before that, Officers Collins and Burbank had made a stop of a person who had a headlight out. And they did their CAD search, and that person, the owner of the vehicle, was African American and had warrants for his arrest. And Officer Collins and Officer Burbank approached the vehicle, gave a warning for the headlight, said clear up the warrants, and let him go. Officer Rankin and Ford backed them up on that call. And it was a quick call. They decided to let the folks go, and they left the scene. Now, as you know, Collins and Burbank went west on 96th, and Ford and Rankin went a different direction. And Officer Collins and Officer Burbank were at the intersection when they actually cleared the scene from the stop there on, I believe it was A Street, where they'd stopped Mr. Bogan's vehicle. And that's important in the timeline. And that was actually what they were taught to do, is you don't clear the scene while you're at the scene, because you're exposed. The person you just stopped could come attack you. You actually drive away and then clear the scene, and that's what they were doing there at 96 and Ainsworth. And as they're sitting there at the stoplight, they see an individual, Mr. Ellis, out in the road. He's out in the middle of the road, in a dangerous area, kind of in this region here. And a car is trying to make a left-hand turn. And this isn't something that they're focused in on. It's something they catch out of the corner of their eye. But they essentially see a person trying to touch the passenger side door handle of this vehicle. Now, it could have been anything, right? It could have been totally innocent. He could have just been dropped off. A little odd to be dropped off in the middle of an intersection. Could have been a family member, a friend, somebody who's trying to flag down. But the nature of the fact that he was trying to open the door handle and the fact that the car drove off in that manner raised some suspicion. Now, Officers Burbank and Collins will tell you that Mr. Ellis had a bag in his hands, carrying something at that time. And so they say, hey man, what are you doing? What are you doing? Officer Collins yells to him from the driver's side, what are you doing out there in the middle of the road? And they weren't necessarily expecting it, but this individual, Mr. Ellis, runs over quickly and gets strangely close to Officer Collins' window. He says, hey, something along the lines of, I'm having a bad night, I've got warrants, I need help. And so Officer Collins says, okay, hey man, it's all good. Why don't you just go over there, sit on the sidewalk, get out of the road so you don't get hit by a car, and we'll talk to you. Officers had no expectation of what was going to happen. It's nothing different than the stop they had just made only about 90 seconds before. And as Mr. Ellis is walking around the police car, Officer Collins grabs his microphone and is about to call it in. Just a routine stop. Hey, we've got an individual, says he's got warrants, needs our help. We're going to talk to him. Before he can do that, he notices that Mr. Ellis has fixated on his partner. He's eyeballing him. He's giving him a look that suggests that there's going to be some kind of interaction, some kind of unfortunate scene. And immediately, Mr. Ellis says something along the lines of, or maybe I'll just punch you in the fucking face. And so as Officer Burbank is rolling his window down, suddenly he's rolling it back up because of the nature of Mr. Ellis's aggression towards him. Officer Collins, being the good partner he is, jumps out of his car, runs around to the front of the police car, and then Ellis turns around, grabs him, throws him. Now, Officer Collins is a big guy. At that time, he weighed 215 pounds. He weighed 235 pounds with all of his gear on. And you saw the pictures, and they're not major scrapes on both elbows, but he was also wearing thick, long-sleeve police uniform. But that's where he got those scrapes, from when Mr. Ellis lifted him and threw him back, and he fell back on his elbows. And then as you've seen, the fight was on. Now we have, obviously, video of portions of this incident, but we have this fight that goes on. And what both Officers Collins and Burbank take away from the incident is that Mr. Ellis has no quit in him. He will not put his hands behind his back. They tase him 3 times. As you've seen, after one of the tasings, Mr. Ellis actually says, "Do it again," right? He gets punched multiple times. You've seen the video where he's getting punched by my client, getting the elbow strikes, and then there's a gap in the video, and then 10 seconds later, in the Seth Cowden video, they've moved positions. And imagine that. Officer Collins, a 235-pound officer, is on top of a guy delivering elbow strikes. And then 10 seconds later, he's now behind Mr. Ellis, who's standing. The state mocks this superhuman strength. But how do you get a 19-year-old or 19-year grappler, how do you get out of that position and get behind him?
Argumentative.
These are just the facts, Your Honor.
Sounds like a bit of an argument. Go ahead.
You've seen the video that Mr. Ellis gets behind Officer Collins. So we know that punching him doesn't work, tasing him doesn't work, the attempted LVNR doesn't work. We hear the grunting and noises that Mr. Ellis is making. Eventually there's kicking. Eventually there's hobbling, kicking, and then even spitting. And all the while, the officer's saying, put your hands behind your back. Put your hands behind your back. That was the intent, was to get him into custody because, as you know, as you learned from Lieutenant Wilson, the paramedics will not help somebody until the scene is safe and the individual is under control. And Mr. Ellis had no intention of becoming under control. Our use of force expert will tell you how dangerous a fight like that is for police officers. He'll tell you that these guys have guns on their hips. As you heard in the testimony, there are live rounds in the chambers. And if a gun gets loose, we know that the magazine, Officer Burbank's magazine, came loose during the struggle. If a gun gets loose, somebody is going to get killed. We know you'll hear about needles in people's pockets and the concern that police have that somebody, when they're trying to take them into custody, will have something, a dangerous weapon or a needle or something in their pockets. You can imagine being in the lane of traffic, how dangerous that is to be in an unsecured fight with somebody. And you're going to hear all the evidence about what a dangerous situation this had become due to Mr. Ellis simply not putting his hands behind his back and going into custody. You'll recall the testimony of Mr. Ellis's fight. There was the expert the state called, I can't remember his name, who talked about how after the police got Mr. Ellis into handcuffs, that he still moved 7.5 feet. This was someone who, when he didn't have cuffs on, they had to tase him, punch him, and try to LV&R him. When they got cuffs on him, he was kicking and thrusting and bucking. When they got him hobbled, he was still kicking and wiggling. And then they had to connect the hobbles to the handcuffs simply to get him restrained. And then he started spitting. There was no quit in him. And then he started bashing his face on the ground, thrashing. Now, in the timeline of events, we know that Officers Collins and Burbank fought with Mr. Ellis for 3 to 4 minutes, which anybody who's ever been in a fight can tell you, or if you ever watched boxing or any MMA sport, 3 to 4 minutes is a long time to be in a knockdown, drag-out brawl. Officers Rankin and Ford show up at 23, 24, 19, and they're only there for about 25 seconds before Sergeant Lim arrives. And it was around that time with Lim, Messinio, and Sanders that they were able to get Mr. Ellis in hobbles and fully restrained. And it was about that time that Officers Collins and Burbank, as they call it, were smoked, and meaning they were just absolutely out of energy and out of they had lactic acid building up in their arms, and they needed a break. So their boss, Sergeant Lim, told them to go up towards the front of the police car, go get a breath, catch a breather. So that's also the time when Sergeant Lim arrived that aid was called. They called for fire, as the police put it. So at 23, 24, 14, or 44, give or take, paramedics are on their way. And we know that at that time, within 30 seconds or so, that Officers Collins and Burbank are out of the scene. That Mr. Ellis is not only alive, but he's going to be alive for at least 10 more minutes. And they're off the case. The only real involvement that they had was when paramedics arrived, Officer Collins went and said, hey, this guy might have excited delirium. Might look out for that. Now, we've heard from Ayanna Malang, or Ayanna White. For a couple years we've been reading reports of Ms. White, but her name is now Malang. And she gave you some really important testimony about the timeline of events. She talked about how it was after 11 at night, she finally got her kids to bed, and things were settling down. Any parent here can understand what it's like to finally get to a situation where you can lay down in your bed after a long day. And so she lays down in her bed, and she starts to hear a commotion outside. Now, she lives on 96 in Ainsworth, so it's not totally unique to have a commotion or some kind of disturbance outside. But like probably all of us would do, is for 30 to 60 seconds, she told you, she laid there hoping that whatever it was would go away and she could go to sleep. Finally, after 30 to 60 seconds, she decided to get up and look out the window and see what was going on. And she described another 30 to 60 seconds of watching a fight out in front of the police car. She described it as one officer fighting Mr. Ellis. And then she talked about waking up her husband, and that being another 15 or so seconds. So, you know, it's always hard with time to know exactly how long, but for about 2 minutes, she witnesses, in sum, the struggle and the fight and the commotion that was going on between Mr. Ellis and the police. Now, Ms. Malang's testimony is completely consistent with what you heard in the recordings of the officers in terms of the timeline. She also has no connection to James' Bible, and her cell phone never miraculously self-combusted. And it was 2 minutes before she heard, and she was very specific about this, she heard Ms. McDowell yelling. She heard the, "Hey, leave him alone," right? She's very clear about that. So that 2-minute period of commotion was broken when she finally heard Ms. McDowell yelling. Now, as I mentioned, officers gave statements. Officers have Fifth Amendment rights. They did not have to give a statement. They know, as police officers, when you give a statement, the risk is, if the evidence comes out and it's inconsistent with your statement, that you're now locked in and you're going to look to be untruthful if somebody contradicts your statement.
Overruled. You may continue.
But they voluntarily gave statements. And ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing in the video evidence that's inconsistent with those statements that these officers gave voluntarily. In fact, Mr. Officer walked through with Officer Collins and his statement, the video, and how play by play he described his interactions with Mr. Ellis. They did it only a few days after, when they knew, as you would expect, police officers would know, that there would be doorbell cameras and Arlo cameras and passersby with cell phones recording the incident. And there is no video evidence that contradicts their version of what happened. Now, the state will tell you that the officers never said anything about how Mr. Ellis said, "I can't breathe." And they said, well, we couldn't hear anything because we're in a fight, and Officer Collins will explain that to you. You also notice that in his statement there is no comment about Mr. Ellis saying, "Do it again," right? Which you'd think would be something that you might say when you're explaining how a person has superhuman strength, who fought you, who's being aggressive. Officer Collins will tell you, "I never heard that either, because I was in a fight. I was in a serious knockdown, dragged out brawl with a person who had nothing to lose and no fight in him." Now, the state relies heavily on Sarah McDowell and Seth Cowden and Mr. Lowry. Now, the most significant factor amongst those three witnesses is that none of them saw Mr. Ellis with anything in his hands. And we know that the evidence suggests that he had the bottle of water. Remember, Mr. Liu in his opening grabbed the bottle of water, right? We know that he went with his EBT card to 7-Eleven and bought water and donuts. The state never showed you these pictures. The state didn't want you to see it. They wanted you to see a lot of pictures of Mr. Ellis's body. They didn't want to show you the water or the donuts.
Argument.
Continue.
But those witnesses, Cowden, McDowell, and Lowry, said he didn't have anything in his hands, and they were very clear about that. Second reason you'll question Ms. McDowell's testimony, if you watch the video, it's the Vivint video, you see her vehicle behind the police vehicle, and you'll hear a little beep. We tried to bring this out in testimony. You hear her honk, and then you'll actually see her put her car in reverse to back up as if she's going to drive around the police vehicle. And it's right about that time that she starts recording and starts yelling. But she was going to drive around the car. She didn't see the whole interchange. She didn't see Mr. Ellis walking down the street, listening to music, observing nature as the state tries to portray this. She didn't see
Your
that.
Honor, objection, argument.
I'll allow that, overruled.
She didn't see that. She was actually honking and then backing up so she could go around the police vehicle. And then we've all seen this from Ms. McDowell. Wait till I'm in the stands. I'm lying to shut you all down. This witness, her testimony and her timeline is totally inconsistent with Iona Malang. It's totally inconsistent with the officer's statements, and it's totally inconsistent
Objection,
with
argument.
logic. When you look at the facts, you see a person, Mr. Ellis, who had methamphetamine in his system, and not only at a lethal rate, but a toxic rate. The suggestion that he was just walking down the street, listening to music, observing nature on 96 and Ainsworth, and that these cops just decided to jump out of their cars and start wailing on him,
Objection, argument.
versus the suggestion that being that high on meth, he was out in the middle of the street causing a disturbance, and that because he was on conditions of release and not to be using methamphetamine, he decided to attack the police. Use your common sense, folks, in evaluating the evidence in this case. What's more likely? A decorated officer?
Objection, argument.
I'll move on here. Thank you. Now, if the officers wanted to jump somebody, would they do it under 2 streetlights? Would their car be parked at the intersection and they would leave the engine running and decide to just jump out and start beating on somebody?
Objection, argument, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Or would they follow him down an alley? Officer Burbank, in his statement, talked about having a baton in the car. You're gonna beat up on somebody when you grab the baton? When you pull over to the side, at least? You see these pictures? State didn't want to show them. You see the smudging there on the left side of the door frame. You see the powdered sugar there on the window. You see it there from a different angle, slightly. It's small, doesn't show up in every angle. You can see it right there. You see a close-up of the powdered sugar, which is totally consistent with a scenario where someone who's eating donuts or carrying a box of donuts starts punching the window of your vehicle. And the state doesn't show you this. And it's totally consistent with the statement the officers gave 3 to 6 days after the incident. And those smudge marks, the reason it's smudged is really significant because it shows that after they got in the fight with Mr. Ellis and went back to their cars and were hot, and they didn't know he was going to die because they never wanted to hurt him, and they didn't know that this evidence was even on the window, they rolled the windows down because they were hot and they needed some fresh air. They didn't even know it mattered. And now here we are, and it really matters because it shows their version is accurate. So this is a murder and manslaughter case, and so the manner of death is important. And I'm not going to get into the law, but the state does have to prove that these officers killed Mr. Ellis. And that's why Dr. Clark's testimony has been so significant. And that's why his initial report is so significant. Dr. Clark testified that there were no anatomical findings in this death. Mr. Ellis didn't have any anatomical signs to lead to a conclusion as to how he died. And he said the meth concentration is well within the fatal range and could have caused Mr. Ellis's death immediately. He said the placement of the spit mask is a significant factor and possibly the most important factor. And as you know, none of these officers had anything to do with the spit mask. He stated, "It is unlikely this death would have occurred due to the physical restraint alone without the contributing conditions of meth intoxication and a dilated heart. He said, furthermore, an argument could be made that the extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor. We're going to call experts. We're only going to try to call a few. But our experts are going to keep it straightforward and simple. They're actually going to dispute the notion that there aren't anatomical findings, because there are two obvious ones. 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of meth in Mr. Ellis's system, bad meth, potentially. Meth for somebody who had been clean and sober for 3 months, thereby lowering how much tolerance he had. 2,400 nanograms. That is an anatomical finding in his blood, in his toxicology report. They're also going to say that he had an enlarged heart, and that his heart could not handle the demand that was put on it after this fight with police where he had no quit in him. Our experts are going to rely on the fact that Mr. Ellis had a pulse for 4 minutes before Lieutenant Wilson started doing CPR. I'm sure you're tired of testimony regarding PEA, pulseless electrical activity, but our experts will just focus on the fact that Lieutenant Wilson wasn't just sitting there twiddling his thumbs for 4 minutes while Mr. Ellis didn't have a pulse, but actually commenced CPR at that moment. Our experts will say that the heart rhythm they see is not consistent with hypoxia. And lastly, we'll call a use of force expert, who's actually from Washington, and who, unlike Jack Ryan, will tell you a little bit about what it's like to work the graveyard shift on 96 in Ainsworth. They'll tell you that you have to look at a person's prior actions with police when they're high on drugs to understand the full picture. Our experts, ladies and gentlemen, will rely on the facts. They will ask you to apply common sense in how we will ask you to apply common sense in how you evaluate those facts. And lastly, we're going to ask that you evaluate Officer Collins. You take into account his 13 years of service to our country and to our city. And in just the way he's fought for you, we ask that you fight for him. Thank you.